Now, after these three presidents, after Jefferson, the Congress asserted its power, and for most of the 1800s, with the exception of the presidency of Jackson and Lincoln, we had a congressionally dominated system. Presidents kept with the constitutional design of having a weak president and an administrator. Richard Eberling just said that in the 19th century was a century of liberty overseas and of a lot of different countries, and that explains the peace. And I agree with him. But I also think here at home, congressional government explains some of that as well. Now, if you have congressional government and war, the arrow goes both ways. It's a double-headed arrow, because I think congressional government tends to lead to more peaceful times, but also more peaceful times lead to congressional government, because you don't have the need for an executive with a lot of power to run a war. And wars are not run well by legislators, because there's a lot of different people. There's 535 in our legislature, and you can't have 535 generals. So naturally, excuse me, naturally, warfare centralizes power, and that's what happened in American history. And so we really have this concentration of power, and it's become an imperial presidency. Now, I'd like to chart that for a little bit through history. And as I mentioned, and I'll look particularly at foreign policy, we have this conception, and you'll hear it on the news, that the president is the sole voice of foreign policy, or the sole organ of foreign policy for the U.S. government. Well, the founders would just pass out if they saw that. The Constitution gives the president the power of command, being the commander-in-chief, to nominate ambassadors for overseas and to receive ambassadors here. It gives the Congress the power to regulate international commerce, declare war, raise armies and maintain a navy, make the regulations for the armed forces, call up the militia, suspend habeas corpus in times of rebellion and invasion. So it would seem to me that it would be quite the reverse, that Congress has a lot of power intrinsically in the Constitution in foreign policy. And of course, the founders meant this commander-in-chief role for the president to be very narrowly focused on the battlefield. And so, and of course, this is expanded, and I'll talk about a little bit more later. So really what we have here is this congressional government, except in the 18th century, or excuse me, 19th century, except for the presidency of Jackson and Lincoln. Now, Jackson had the little problem, they both had the same problem. South Carolina was, in the case of Andrew Jackson, South Carolina was nullifying a federal tariff, and Jackson used quite a lot of coercive techniques to bring South Carolina back into the fold. He threatened to hang all the people who in South Carolina who were advocating that, and he readied the nation for war by mobilizing the military to take a military action. And of course, South Carolina backed down. Of course, we have the Lincoln example, which our next speaker will get into much more than I, but Lincoln was a virtual dictator using censorship, closing newspapers, throwing opposition people in jail, suspending habeas corpus in non-combat areas without congressional approval. And then, of course, he accepted that the Congress during that period instituted the income tax. And then Lincoln, of course, expanded the Army unilaterally and called up the militia without congressional authority, which, of course, caused the northern tier of southern states to secede. So many of these aggregations of power in these two instances, they set bad precedents, and these precedents will be dredged up in future American history. For instance, the income tax keeps coming back later on. But much of this aggrandizement of executive power kind of withered away after the Civil War. Now, it didn't totally wither away, and we have it's latently sitting there to be, these precedents to be dredged up later. In 1860, before the Civil War, that may have been the nadir of the federal government. It was very small and very weak before the Civil War, and of course the Civil War had this, they had to raise massive armies and that sort of thing. And so we had this problem, but it wasn't like later on when the government tended to stay around in massive proportions after a war. Now, the Congressional Government resumed again from the Civil War until the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War was a very small war, but had really large implications. First of all, it was the first, well, citizens of Hawaii might argue this, but it was really the first colonial war, and we got an overseas empire from it. That was the first problem. The second thing was that it created a much more powerful presidency. Many historians call Teddy Roosevelt the first modern president because he used the bully pulpit, et cetera, and his charisma to get what he wanted. But actually, McKinley, who was a much more soft-spoken president, I think is a much more important president than Teddy Roosevelt because he really institutionalized a more powerful presidency, which then Teddy Roosevelt combined with his charisma to publicize. For instance, McKinley, he was the first president to go on a speaking tour. Previous to that, it was considered unseemly for presidents to address the public unless it was a ceremonial thing like the Gettysburg Address or that sort of thing. But McKinley went out and he went on a speaking tour. He developed really invented the bully pulpit for the U.S. president to promote his policies. And as I mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt copied him in that. McKinley also strengthened the presidential bureaucracy, and he was the first president to court the press in a major way. He created a press office in the White House especially designed to do this. So we have this ending of the congressional government, era of congressional government with the Spanish-American War. And of course, then we got after the Spanish-American War, we got Teddy Roosevelt. And he was a very activist president. Of course, the big change, though, came when Woodrow Wilson mobilized the American economy for World War I. This was the first time that the American economy had been mobilized totally for a war because warfare had reached such a large scale. This didn't even happen during the Civil War. And of course, Wilson was able to get a lot of power on war production. Almost anything was controlled by him. The civil liberties crackdown. Now, Wilson had written this book as a professor that said that we had an era of congressional government, and he wanted to move away from that. He thought the president should take more power, and of course, he did just that. But no one could say that he didn't advertise what he was going to do. So the World War I further strengthened the presidency, and Wilson was very careful. You see this moving up in increments. Wilson was very careful to get congressional approval for everything he did, and of course during the war, Congress advocated its authority over interstate commerce and everything else to the president. And we see this over history. The president's not the only one at fault here. Congress willingly gives up its power. And there are several reasons why Congress does that. I'll not go into them too much here because I'm time limited. But I think the key thing is that the president still wasn't acting without restraint. But certainly the government is getting bigger, and World War I is really the advent of a permanent big government, because government really didn't go away after World War I.